When Jim McMurtry, a respected BC educator, predicted his own firing in a 2016 book, he didn't know his words would ignite a national firestorm years later. Punished for defying the script during the peak of 2021's cultural reckoning, Jim lost his career, but not his voice. His new book, The Scarlet Lesson, lays bare the price of truth in a system built on compliance. And Jim is going to share his gripping journey from classroom to front page controversy and why he'd rather die standing than live kneeling. The new book is called The Scarlet Lesson. Jim McMurtry, welcome back to the Richard Syrett Show one last time. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Always wonderful to be with you, Richard.
Great to have you. So your story begins with a prophetic warning in your 2016 book, A High School Teacher Bears All, where you foresaw the risks that teachers face in speaking freely. What inspired you to write that book back in 2016, and how did it feel to see your prediction sadly come true in such a public way?
Yeah, I should say that I also predicted that I would be on the front page of a national newspaper. Again, that was long before it actually happened. So I was on the national page of the National Post. So political correctness is something that's been in the school system, society for a long time, which is a way for people to narrow speech. So we can't be offensive to anyone or about anything. And increasingly, there was less and less that the teacher could say. And so when I was fired years later, it was about residential schools and really about other things that are current today, race, gender ideology, and so forth. But back then, it was similar. It was the idea that there was right speech and wrong speech, and any teacher that didn't do what his or her superiors wanted, it was so, which is to me grossly inconsistent with what one does in a school, which is to get kids to think better, and they can't think better unless their ideas are tested.
So your firing in 2021 came at the height of what you call peak woke. So for those who haven't heard you on the program before or followed your story, what specific things did you say or do that led to your dismissal, and how did they challenge the prevailing narrative at the time?
Well, the prevailing narrative was, again, particularly focused on race. As we know, a year earlier, we had the George Floyd in Minneapolis, and it was as though everybody was ready to say defund the police, and our American society was awful. And a year later, Trudeau wanted to, it seemed, ape this moral social panic, and by instead of black people, although we did have that in Canada as well, and he did take a knee and he did all sorts of things to favor people of a darker hue. But the Indigenous thing was his particular ticket for virtue signaling. So the narrative, this is the problem for me, and I think many people, is whatever narrative is, to some people it may be valid, but it is not something that should be taught to students, and it shouldn't be something that a government spends. Our Conrad Black estimated that the amount of money that's been spent on Indigenous people since Confederation is $4.3 trillion. So I think if there's narratives, that's normal and acceptable, and not everyone's going to agree. But the idea of making it exclusive, that there is a monopoly on truth and on thought, is particularly antithetical to a classroom where one is supposed to engage in a multiplicity of perspectives. If I have a child from Syria who's lived through war, that child is going to have a different take, perhaps, on war than somebody who's never experienced it in the classroom. And I don't think that we should be in the business of telling kids what to think. They should come to their own conclusions. So to me, the narrative, whether it was gender ideology and the trans stuff, whether it was race, whether it was indigenization, whether it's literature, which is being increasingly censored, the defamation of the dead, the daily land acknowledgements, the deformation of history. I could go on. In fact, the lowering of standards behaviorally and academically. What all this is about is it's an opportunity for the people at the top of the system to be performative. Say, look how bad everybody before me was, but now I'm going to lead schools to the promised land. And that's fine. They can have their vision and so forth, but it should be challenged. If they're going to present, white Christian children in schools as being demons, I think that's highly problematic. And that's what happened in Kamloops, because the Christian teachers at those schools aren't here to stand up for themselves. If they didn't murder children, particularly 215 in one school, a school where there was an Indigenous principal and 3 Indigenous teachers, then we should not libel them as murderers.
You've said it's better to die on one's feet than to live on one's knees. How did this conviction guide your decisions when you were given the chance to quit rather than be fired?
Yeah, I certainly was, and maybe in some ways I'm still being given that chance, Richard. And I should note, by the way, that it's 4 years to the day that news came out on Kamloops. So May 27, 2021 was the day that Canada changed, and a year later we called ourselves a genocidal state. So I think I'm not somebody any different than anybody else. Outside of, perhaps I'm just older than most teachers, and I just was too old in the job to want to give up on the principles the precepts that had guided us, which among other things is open debate. So I've been offered money. I've been offered obviously less punishment. I've been offered my job back. I've been offered all sorts of things. But I'm not going to take any of that, because what's important here, what's at stake, is really the foundation of Canada. If we're going to lie about our past, then that means we're going to continue to lie about our present and our future.
Your dismissal, as I mentioned, made national headlines. In one report, your face, I think, covered nearly half the front page of a major newspaper. How did it, I don't think we've ever really discussed this in depth. How did it feel to become the center of such a public controversy, if you will, and specifically, what impact did it have on you and your family?
Well, it wasn't very pleasant, because my father was the former Chief Justice of Ontario. He was still alive, and I did not want to bring shame or any form of disgrace upon such a wonderful father. So for 2 whole years, Richard, I didn't tell my parents that I was fired, and they didn't read the National Post. But eventually, when it came to the National Post, it was too late. So my story, I was let out in 2021, but not officially fired for 2 years. So did it have an effect on my family? Yes, to this day, because there's some people that are so wedded to prevailing views and popular discourse and saying, oh my gosh, we need to do more for minorities. But if one really thinks about it, as Jordan Peterson said, we're all a minority. We're all a minority of one. And as a teacher, what you need to do is you need to look out for the individuals in the classroom and not assume that a child sitting down in front of you is representative of his or her race. It's just little Sally or little Trevor or Inder. And we need to stop having this identitarian politics running through school to the point where you have kindergarten kids memorizing the colors of the pride flag.
In your new book, The Scarlet Lesson, you reflect on your experience as a cautionary tale. What would you say is the central lesson you want readers to take away from your story?
That people in a power abuse. There's a lovely quote from Lord Acton that says, power, as you know, absolute power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt, absolutely. And so if you do not hold people in power, if you don't hold their feet to the fire, then they're going to pay themselves more money, then they're going to assume a bigger role for themselves. They're going to want more prestige. And then opportunities will come along to, I think, completely usurp democratic rule. And I think that's what's happened in the school system. Teachers do not open their mouths at staff meetings. Parents are afraid to go in and talk to the principal. Kids are afraid to open their mouths in classroom. It's this idea that if we're not careful in a democratic world, we'll quickly become undemocratic, because more than half the world doesn't live with democracy. So we don't have to look very far to see that it's a very big danger if you take away people's right to think freely.
And with the Scarlet Lesson now available, what do you hope its impact will be on the ongoing conversation about education and free expression, and maybe more importantly, or most importantly, cultural conformity?
Well, those are excellent questions, and I'm not sure I can remember every part of it, but very sophisticated. What I hope to get from the book, Richard, is a number of things. Um, and I guess if I had to tailor just a few right now, one of them is for people to see what happens in administrative workplace law, where there's very little entitlement to due process, to procedural fairness. I want people to see what happens when a society becomes drunk on a narrative. And as we saw in the Salem witch trials, you had children being hanged. So people can go crazy sometimes, and they have to stop adopting a mob mentality and start, if they care about history, they have to learn about it themselves and not just presume the people at the top are going to agree with them. The most important thing, perhaps for me, Richard, and I could talk about this for a time, but I'll just end with there's a third thing that I want to achieve with my book. I wanted this to be a personal example of somebody saying no. And what I mean by saying no is everything I've done was in the last few years is what I'm not supposed to do. I'm not supposed to say all sorts of things. I'm supposed to keep quiet, just sort of stay at home forever, never teach again, and not draw a salary. And I didn't think that was fair to me. But I know it's hard when you do stand up. And so it hasn't been an easy 4 years. But I think what I have done is I think I have encouraged people to do what's right. And all, the beautiful quote that you know about from Burke that says, all it takes for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. I refuse to do nothing. You don't lie to students about gender, about race, particularly about teachers back in Canadian history who came over to Canada to give their lives up to Indigenous children. You don't present them in today's world as serial killers.
Any advice for other educators who might find themselves in a similar situation?
Well, it's hard because I know that they'll end up like me if they, it's very difficult not to conform. People go along to get along. I understand that. But I think in life, Richard, you have to realize that there are these core values. And without them, we're left with nothing. And I think Canada has always been a country where, not just an educational system, but there particularly, we do our best to raise children, to develop them, to prepare them for the future. And it's just unacceptable for me for teachers to go along with lies. I just think there comes a time where you can no longer look. I know there are people in Auschwitz and elsewhere in these concentration camps that put children into ovens. There's no end to what the capacity of ordinary humans to do things because it gives them a meal ticket. I know a lot of people probably are disappointed when those ovens were closed because they were thrown out of work. So that's an extreme example, but I just don't think we should have an educational system where people are afraid of doing right by children.
The Scarlet Lesson is available now. How do we get a copy, Jim?
Well, the easiest way is to go to jimmcmurtry.com. But also, if you're on Amazon, you can look up Jim McMurtry or the Scarlet Lesson. And the idea, Richard, with Scarlet Letter, which is a sequel to the Scarlet Letter, is you have a public that's gone mad. And the person who ends up having to wear the letter, who is to be disgraced forever, is often the one person who's not being harmful.
It's very profound, and I hope people will pick up a copy. And Jim, thank you for coming onto the program and telling your story over the years. You're a very courageous man, and I wish you peace and love, and God bless you, sir.
You're a special man, Richard. Thank you.
Hey, this is Richard Serrett. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe.